Finley died in the very early hours of Christmas Day 2020. He was in his cot in your bedroom at home. He died of septicemia, endocarditis and pneumonia. The infections which killed him had all set in and taken hold because of the extensive fractures to Finley's ribs and other bones, which acting together you inflicted on him, and I'm sure you did so before the 16th of December, which was more than 9 days before he died. You both knew that Finley was very seriously ill and dying as a result of what you had done to him, yet you deliberately failed to seek any medical help for him, and you deliberately made sure that he was not seen by anyone who could have rescued him and taken him away from your care. Medical intervention would have saved Finley's life, and if Finley had been given antibiotics and the necessary care in the minutes and hours before he died, he would have made a complete recovery. He would have been alive today. I'm sure that you both knew Finley was dead when you dialed 999 at 2:27 a.m. on Christmas Day. Finley had, by that time, been dead for over half an hour. 5 minutes later, there was a very experienced paramedic on the scene. He had been told there was a paediatric arrest, and when he arrived, he could see straight away that Finley did not have a pulse. He was unkempt and dirty, his clothes were dirty and stained, and there were obvious marks and wounds around his mouth and nose. The paramedic then asked both of you for a history of what had happened that evening, and you both lied to him. You told him you thought Finley had COVID, that he was fine when he went to bed at 7 p.m, and that he'd been woken for a final feed around midnight before you went to bed. None of that was true. Finley was rushed to hospital with you, Shannon Marsden. Nothing could be done. Many of the marks and bruises on Finley's body were obvious to the doctors who saw him and tried to revive him. You, Shannon Marsden, told various lies to the doctors that night when they were trying to understand what had happened to Finley in the days before he died. You, Stephen Boden, arrived at the hospital at 4:20 a.m, and once there, you too lied to the doctors about the final hours and days of Finley's life. There is a standard process which follows the unexpected death of a child, and that process was adopted in this case. Finley's body was examined by a variety of medical experts who provided opinions as to what they had found. These skilled medical examinations identified the cause of Finley's death and revealed numerous non-accidental injuries to his body. Finley had 46 rib fractures. 12 other bones were fractured. These included Finley's pelvis, both his legs, both his collarbones, his left shoulder blade and his right arm. The agreed medical evidence was that these fractures were all inflicted between the 4th and 22nd of December, and they all caused Finley severe pain and suffering. Considerable force was required to cause these fractures. The rib fractures were caused by forceful compression of Finley's chest. The fractures to Finley's ribs and the pain that caused to him meant that he could not breathe properly. Pneumonia then took hold in his lungs, and it was that untreated infection which spread through his body and developed into osteomyelitis, endocarditis and septicemia. It was those infections which killed him. The fractures to the pelvis were caused by forceful pressing down on the hip area. The fractures to the collarbones were caused by forceful squeezing of the shoulders towards the chest. or direct blows to the fracture sites. The spiral fracture to the right femur was caused by holding Finley's knee and twisting the leg. The fracture to the right tibia was caused by forceful gripping and twisting the leg. The fractures to the shoulder blade, arm and other fractures to Finley's legs were caused by direct blunt force blows. There were 50 bruises, 11 abrasions and 9 marks to Finley's body. Most of these bruises, abrasions and red marks were to Finley's head and face. I'm sure that the circular bruises on Finley's head and face were imprint marks, and they show that Finley was held on the head with excessive force on a number of occasions. The upper and lower frenulum in Finley's mouth was torn and ulcerated. There were inflicted injuries caused most likely by pushing Finley's feeding bottle into his mouth with excessive force, or by a strike or forceful push against his mouth. There were extensive areas of burns on his left hand. The first area over his fingers were caused by contact burning. The area on the side of his hand and little finger were caused by flame burning. These burns caused Finley intense pain. As to the infections, the infection of osteomyelitis in Finley's bones caused him deep throbbing pain. He would have had a fever, discomfort and suffering as a result of the pneumonia and endocarditis. The medical experts also identified that Finley's thymus gland was severely depleted. This was a consequence of the severe or prolonged stress to Finley's body, trying to fight disease and infection. From all the evidence, I am sure that the fractures were inflicted on at least 2 separate occasions by sustained brutal assaults. It may well have been more, but I cannot be sure of this. The first occasion was the 12th of December 2020. The second occasion was between the afternoon of the 14th of December and the morning of the 16th of December. I'm also sure, given the nature and number of other injuries and their location on Finley's body, that he was subject to repeated abuse on multiple occasions. Once the injuries had been inflicted, Finley's daily experience was one of considerable pain, distress and suffering. The consequence of all the fractures to Finley's body was that it was obvious to both of you by the 16th of December that Finley was very seriously injured and he was utterly miserable. Finley was no longer able to sit up and play with his toys. He was no longer able to feed himself. Everyday activities such as changing his nappy, lifting his arms, putting outdoor clothing on him, or putting him in his pushchair, all caused him severe pain. The pain in his fractured pelvis and thigh bone could only have been alleviated by morphine and immobilising his body. You also knew that Finley was not eating his food. Instead of gaining weight, he lost weight. That was because, as he had so many fractures, eating caused him pain and he was not well enough to eat. And on top of that, his body was fighting the infections that he had. By the evening of the 23rd of December, he was plainly dying. There was nothing subtle about this at all. It was totally obvious to both of you. I now turn to some of the background. You met each other in the summer of 2017.
We're going to come away from that sentencing briefly as the cameras there are talking about things that are delicate within that sentencing process. If you are joining us, we're watching the sentencing live of parents Shannon Marsden and Stephen Boden. They were convicted of murdering their 10-month-old baby, Finley Boden, on Christmas Day of 2020. At the heart of this case, of course, the unthinkable suffering of a baby, and the judge speaking directly to the parents there, outlining exactly what she thinks they were aware of doing at the time. You knew, she said, that he was seriously ill and dying. She said you knew when you called 999 that Finley was dead. That is the judge's opinion. She says that the last days of Finley Boden were terrible to describe, deeply distressing. He died in the end of septicemia, pneumonia, endocarditis. We are going to return to the court. As I say, some parts of what's being said are not able to be heard by the public. Let's take you back, though, to what we can hear now.
After the 17th of November, there were visits from the health visitor and the social worker on the 19th, 20th and 27th of November. From what they saw, and from the lies you both told them, they thought things were going well. The true position, which they were unaware of, was that you were both using large amounts of cannabis, were in financial difficulties, were arguing, and were not coping very well with the children due to lack of sleep and being woken at night. On top of that, there was an inflicted bruise on Finley's forehead, which the health visitor and social worker both saw, and you lied to both. By the 29th of November, there were bruises on the fleshy part of Finley's cheek, the junction between his cheek and ear, and on the side of his scalp. These were also inflicted injuries, and I'm sure they were not the same bruises seen by the health visitor on the 19th of November.
All right, we're just coming away because, as I say, the ability for us to have cameras within family courts has only been around since last summer, and there are, of course, understandably, parts that the public is not allowed to listen to. We went into one of those just now. Just to remind you, if you're joining us now, we're watching the sentencing of parents Shannon Marsden and Stephen Boden, convicted of murdering their 10-month-old baby, Finley Boden, on Christmas Day of 2020. We are going to take you to the court. There is now a continuation of what we are able to hear. Let's take you back to that sentencing, which is important to listen to.
Only you two know what actually happened within your home at 218 Holland Road after the 4th of December. Your home was a very small terraced house. You both saw and heard what went on within your own house, and you knew that your neighbours could hear through the walls if there was any loud noise or disturbance. You kept yourselves to yourselves, and you were desperate to ensure nothing should happen which could possibly be reported to the authorities by any of your neighbours, as had happened in the past. I'm also sure that as time went on, you were out of the house with the boys for several hours each day, so that if there were any unannounced visits from social care, they would not find you at home and could not check up on you and your children. You were both regularly using large amounts of cannabis in December 2020. Every day you, Stephen Boden, went to collect cannabis from your dealer, usually with one of the children. You both smoked cannabis at the rear of your house, which stank of it. You were also smoking cannabis in the house, and in particular in your bedroom, and that is why there was cannabis in Finley's blood when he died. On top of that, it's well established that cannabis causes high levels of anxiety, depression and restlessness due to lack of sleep, and adversely affects any adult's ability to parent a young child.
All right, we're just taking you away from Derby Crown Court there, where the sentencing of parents Shannon, Marsden and Stephen Boden, convicted of killing their 10-month-old baby Finley Boden on Christmas Day of 2020, continues. The judge outlining the pain and suffering that would have been felt by the 10-month-old baby in the weeks leading up to his death. Her assessment is that 2 occasions of brutal assault occurred in the days and weeks leading up to his death. He would have been no longer able to sit up or to play. Even changing a nappy or feeding himself would have been impossible for the baby. Let's listen back in.
What is then clear from the evidence is that something very significant happened in your home in the early hours of Saturday, the 12th of December. 12 hours later, you, Stephen Boden, were telling your drug dealer that you were after more cannabis because...
And as you saw there, in fact, it popped up on your screens. For legal reasons, we aren't able to bring you the whole of this live feed from the court, the Derby Crown Court, there in the sentencing of the parents of Finley Boden, who was 10 months old when he was murdered by those parents. It's worth saying that we are able, as we say, to bring you the live feed apart from those areas that are legally sensitive. So far, the judge reiterating this pain and suffering of the 10-month-old, describing the fact that he would have died from septicemia, pneumonia and endocarditis brought on by the 130 injuries that he sustained in those days leading up to his death. 71 bruises and cuts, 57 bone fractures and 2 burns in those 3 weeks prior to his death. He had been returned to his parents just over a month before he died, having been in care previous to that. Finley had that care order a month before being born, but the court ruled later that the parents posed no risk to the baby. They ordered him to be returned to them without any drugs testing being needed, despite the fact that they had been using cannabis. I think we can now take you back to the court. Let's listen in.
That is because to get hold of the drugs when you were struggling to find any money to pay for them, you no doubt wanted your dealer to somehow feel sorry for you. This was the first occasion there was any suggestion that Finley was unwell, and I'm sure that by the 12th of December, Finley had been really seriously injured, and that was why he was so ill. I'm sure that it was on this occasion that some or all of the rib fractures were inflicted on Finley. Other bones may also have been fractured on this occasion, but I cannot be sure which. On the afternoon of the 14th...
Sky's Katerina Vitozzi. She is at Derby Crown Court and has been listening to that. Katerina, an unthinkable catalogue of assault and injury inflicted upon a defenceless 10-month-old. Just describe to us the scene in the courtroom today.
It's been an extremely distressing case for everyone involved in it. Even the prosecution described it as something that was complex and distressing for everyone involved, and that is between both police officers and the prosecution and defence teams, of course. But we've also heard victim impact statements read out on behalf of Finley's maternal family, so family members of Finley's mother, Shannon Marsden, as well as the family of Stephen Boden, Finley's father, and the impact on those family members, obviously losing this 10-month-old baby, absolutely tremendous, describing this as an event that would haunt them forever, saying that this was an unthinkable crime and how could anyone inflict harm on any hair of baby Finley's head. Even in one of the victim impact statements, a relative of Stephen Boden describing the pair as monsters. They said that we will never forget Finley but we will forget you. Those sentencing remarks now coming from inside Derby Crown Court behind me, more extensive than you would ever really expect, given the complexity and the amount of detail that has to be reviewed ahead of the sentence being delivered. Baby Finley died with more than 130 injuries. They included bone fractures, bruising and burns, 2 separate burns, which the prosecution and medical evidence suggested had been caused by a lighter. Those were injuries which led to baby Finley, then just 10 months old, succumbing to extreme infections, septicemia, which then led to his death. A death that the judge, in her summing up comments, said could have been saved if the couple had sought medical help. She said they didn't in order to cover their tracks.
And Katerina, we are going to go back to that sentencing. Thank you for the update from your side. But as we say, the background has been given by the judge. Let's listen in again.
Finley was really, really ill on the 17th of December. And by the 18th of December, you had both agreed that you would lie and say that Finley was ill because he might have COVID and that you had ordered a COVID test. You both knew full well that Finley did not have COVID, and you did this because you knew that if anyone asked to see Finley, this was the perfect excuse why they could not do so and why they could not come inside your house. It was an excuse that worked because you are both persuasive and accomplished liars, and because of the continued fear which was associated with infection from COVID at that time. By the 19th of December, you both knew that Finley was really, really, really ill, with a really bad chesty cough, runny eyes, and that he had no energy and wanted to sleep all day, and you could hear his chest all day rattling and wheezing.
Well, let's break away from there and take you back to Katerina Vitozzi, who's at Derby Crown Court. And Katerina, interesting there, the judge saying that on the 17th or 18th of December, the parents decided to lie and create this story about baby Finley having COVID in order to stop anyone coming into the home. Just speaking to, of course, if we cast our minds back to December of 2020, that would have been a very persuasive argument.
Yes, the couple repeatedly lied to social services, that being one excuse that they had decided to present to social services in order to stop people coming into their home, that Finley had COVID. But throughout this case, the prosecution said that Shannon Marsden and her partner, Stephen Boden, simply lied to social services. They told social services that they were both drug-free, that their home was a clean and safe environment. And when police attended the house on Christmas Day 2020, when Finley was dead, they found absolutely the opposite of that. They found a house that was filthy, that smelt of urine and cannabis, and a baby who was dead and clearly presenting with bruises across his tiny body. There are, of course, questions about what happened in the months that led to Finley being returned to the care of his parents. A decision was made to take him into care before he was born, and he remained in care for around 8 months before he was returned under court order full-time to his parents. Now, that decision will now be reflected upon. There is a safeguarding review that will look at how it was decided that his parents were safe to look after their son. But today, the focus on his parents, on Shannon Marsden and Stephen Boden, as to what happened and what they did to their son.
Absolutely. Katerina, thank you. We are going to return to Derby Crown Court to listen to the judge's sentencing.
In the meantime, on the 21st of December, you, Stephen Boden, had lied to the health visitor and cancelled her visit by saying that Finley had to have a COVID test. On the afternoon of the 23rd of December, the social worker, Emily, made an unannounced visit to your house to see Finley. You, Shannon Marsden, had told her on the phone earlier in the day that Finley was unwell and you'd ordered a COVID test. When Emily came to the door, you, Shannon Marsden, were outside the house picking up drugs from your dealer, and you, Stephen Boden, had no intention of letting Emily see Finley. You told her Finley was upstairs asleep unwell. Emily made it clear to you that a statutory protection visit needed to be completed as she'd not seen Finley, and you understood she would come back the next day. Emily then walked down the hill to speak to you, Shannon Marsden, on your own. You told her you were fine, and you deliberately did not tell her that there was anything very seriously wrong with Finley. You chose to lie to Emily, knowing very well that she was there to check up on the children and that she could and would have given you any help and assistance if you needed it. Emily left your house that day thinking that Finley had COVID symptoms because she believed the lies both of you had told her. Your neighbour Amy only heard Finley cry once, and that was in the early hours of Christmas Eve. I'm sure that the injuries to Finley were inflicted on him in your home, and when that happened, Finley would have screamed or cried in pain. The neighbours did not hear anything, and you had to make sure they did not hear anything. Otherwise, they might have called the police, social care would have been involved, and the boys would have been removed from you. You were both determined that that would never happen. No one heard Finley cry or scream in pain because you inflicted the injuries I've described on him together, with one of you fracturing his bones and the other keeping him quiet with your hand over his mouth. What happened could only have been achieved by two people acting together. And together you lied to all the people, namely your family, your social worker and the health visitor, who could have helped Finley and ensure he was immediately removed from your care. By the evening of the 23rd of December, you both knew that Finley...
If you're joining us now, you are watching the sentencing of parents Shannon Marsden and Stephen Boden, convicted of murdering their 10-month-old baby Finley Boden on Christmas Day 2020. Let's go back.
This. You knew that sepsis was a life-threatening condition, and you both knew that if Finley was that ill, then you needed to take him immediately to hospital or call 999. That is because that is what the information you had Googled on your phone told you to do. And it would have also been absolutely obvious to you, looking at Finley lying on the floor of the sitting room, dying. And you, Stephen Boden, in your evidence accepted that you knew Finley was dying when you were shown the haunting image of Finley shortly after 7 p.m. on the 23rd of December. That is...
And we are just going to leave there the sentencing of Derby Crown Court, the sentencing of the parents of Finley Boden. As we say, there are some parts of this sentencing that we are not allowed to broadcast. We will go back in now.
It is a deeply upsetting and chilling image compared to the picture of the playful child patting the dog only a few weeks earlier. You both still did nothing to help Finley. Rather, you continued to leave him to suffer. The next day, Christmas Eve, you went out as a family shopping in Chesterfield for 3.5 hours with Finley in his pram. You did that to ensure that in that time social care would not find you at home. Getting Finley ready to go out, moving him in and out of his pram, would have caused him excruciating pain. Then, in the cold December evening, you all went out for another hour to Tesco and one shop in Old Whittington. The items you bought included formula milk for Finley. When you got home, Finley was put to bed in his cot, and by the early hours of Christmas Day, he was dead. You delayed calling the ambulance, but once you had done so, the paramedics were almost immediately at your home at 2:32 a.m. on Christmas Day, and shortly after that, the police were there. They noticed straight away the strong smell of cannabis. The photographs taken by the police on Christmas Day lay bare the filthy, unsanitary and unsafe conditions in which Finley was living. The bedding on his cot was covered in blood and vomit, as were his baby grows and vests. Other bedding which had been removed from his cot was likewise covered in blood and vomit, and you were both well aware of this. Finley's cot was, after all, by Christmas Eve in your bedroom, beside your own bed.
Court describing the horrendous events leading up to the death of 10-month-old Finley Boden on Christmas Day of 2020 at the hands of his parents, Shannon Marsden and Stephen Boden. We can continue to listen in to that sentencing.
The police recovered from your house empty bottles of Calpol, which in total had contained a month's worth of doses of Calpol, much of which you, Stephen Boden, had given to Finley. Calpol provided very little of any relief to all the pain Finley was suffering, given the nature and extent of his injuries. Stephen Boden and Shannon Marsden, I must sentence you both for murder. The only sentence I can pass on you is one of life imprisonment. It is, in any event, the proper sentence for your crime. I also have to set the minimum term that you must serve before the parole board can consider you for release. That minimum term will reflect your overall criminality. The minimum term does not represent the time you will actually spend in custody. It is simply the minimum period that you must spend in prison before your case can even be considered by the parole board. If they do not order your release, you will remain in custody for the rest of your life. If they do release you, you will be liable to recall to custody for the rest of your life. I must set the minimum term by reference to Schedule 21 of the Sentencing Code as Parliament has enacted. I judge this to be a case which does not fall within paragraphs 2 to 4 of Schedule 21 and therefore has a starting point of 15 years. Having identified the starting point, I have to take into account the aggravating or mitigating factors to the extent I've not allowed for them in my choice of starting point. Stephen Boden, you are 30 years old and were born on the 21st of November 1992. You were 28 years old when you murdered Finley. You have 22 convictions for 33 offences, which include theft, drug offences, criminal damage, and failure to comply with court orders. In 2018, you were resentenced to 4 months in prison in respect of 2 breaches of a community order. Your previous convictions do not include any offences for violence against a person. You've smoked cannabis since you were 9 years old, and apart from when you were in prison, you always used cannabis. You left home when you were 18 or 19 and then lived with your relatives for a time. Shannon Marsden, you are 22 years old and were born on the 4th of August 2000. You were 20 years old when you murdered Finley. You have no previous convictions or cautions. You were drinking from when you were 9 years old and using cannabis from when you were 10. You were unhappy at home, were bullied at school and got into arguments and fights with other pupils. You would self-harm, had issues with your mental health and were happiest when you were away from home with your aunts at Wirksworth. That was where you lived with Stephen Boden when your relationship began in the summer of 2017 and until he got the house in Holland Road in February 2018. As to the relationship between you, regular arguments were a feature of that relationship from the outset. You, Stephen Boden, have a short temper and can get uncontrollably and aggressively angry. Arguments are not one-sided, and I am quite sure that you, Shannon Marsden, were quite capable of standing your own ground in any argument with Stephen Boden. You were not isolated by Stephen Boden, and you were in regular phone contact with your mother, who you spoke to at length almost every day. You knew how to get help if you needed it. I'm also sure that you, Shannon Marsden, were pushed and hit and verbally abused by Stephen Boden in your relationship with him, and that was happening in December 2020. The extent of the abuse and violence in your relationship was considerably exaggerated by you, Shannon Marsden, in your evidence at trial, and I am sure that it did not affect your decision-making in relation to Finley or your ability to make those decisions. You both wanted a family, but you wanted it on your terms without any regard to your cannabis use or the safety of your children. You hated the involvement of social care or any of the authorities in your family. You were determined that once you were back together as a family on the 17th of November, that you should not be separated from the boys again. You had lied to get your family reunited, and once reunited, it was not long before you were unable to cope with and parent two small boys, a situation compounded by your habitual drug use. You both knew that as soon as anyone knew that Finley was injured, the boys would be taken away from you and your family life would be immediately over. Having brutally assaulted Finley on at least 2 occasions, you continued to abuse him, and you lied that he had COVID so that no one would see him and remove him from your care, and in doing so, you subjected your own baby son to unimaginable cruelty. There are a number of aggravating factors. First, you were Finley's parents, in a position of trust over him, with sole responsibility for caring and protecting him in his own home. He was a 10-month-old baby and was particularly vulnerable. Taken together, these are a powerful aggravating factor. Second, there were at least 2 sustained and brutal assaults to Finley, in which injuries were inflicted on him in a number of different ways. The first assault was on the 12th of December. The second one was 2 to 3 days later. Finley was subjected to repeated abuse on multiple occasions, which included burning his hand, and that abuse had started by the 19th of November. Once Finley had been really seriously injured on the 12th of December, everyday activities such as dressing him, changing his nappy, taking him out of his pram caused him considerable pain, and he was living in filthy conditions. You inflicted significant mental and physical suffering on Finley for an extensive period, which was at least 13 days in length, and throughout that period he was suffering mentally and physically. Third, you failed to seek any medical assistance or any help from your family, the social worker or the health visitor at any point when it was obvious to you that Finley was very seriously injured and unwell. Rather, you deliberately lied to all those who could have helped you by saying that Finley had COVID, so that no one would come into the house or ask to go near him. And when he died, you delayed calling the ambulance and then lied to the paramedics and doctors about the last hours and days of Finley's life. Fourth, the murder was committed by 2 of you acting together.
There are elements, as we've been saying, of this sentencing that we are not allowed to bring you for legal reasons. The sentencing of parents of 10-month-old Finley Boden, who died on Christmas Day of 2020 at the hands of his parents. The judge so far has stated the only proper sentence that she can pass for Shannon Marsden and Stephen Boden's crime is life imprisonment. She's added that whatever minimum term she passes is the minimum amount of time they must serve before they become eligible for parole. The judge, Mrs. Justice Amanda Tipples, is continuing with that sentencing. Let's have a listen.
20. Sixth, I'm sure that you were under the influence of cannabis when you brutally assaulted Finley. It is accepted by you through your barristers that collectively these aggravating factors justify a very significant uplift from the starting point of 15 years that I have identified. In mitigation, it's said that neither of you had an intention to kill Finley. I cannot be sure that the brutal assaults on Finley were premeditated or that when they happened there was an intention to kill. However, in the present context, I do not regard this point as providing any mitigation. This is because it's completely undermined by your repeated abuse of Finley and the dreadful cruelty and suffering you deliberately subjected him to over an extensive period of 13 days and which culminated in his death. You, Shannon Marsden, also refer to your age in mitigation. I accept that at 20, you were less mature than Stephen Boden, and that together with your lack of previous convictions, those are mitigating factors which count in your favour. I have also read and taken into account the psychiatric report of Professor Gillian Metzi dated the 2nd of September 2022. I am sure that you were quite capable of making decisions about Finley right up until the 25th of December, which would have saved his life. I am quite sure that there is nothing about your circumstances at that time or the domestic abuse or violence you were subject to that prevented you from doing so. Rather, you deliberately chose to do nothing, which meant Finley suffered and died. Neither of you have shown any remorse at all for what you have done. Weighing up these factors, the minimum term in your case, Stephen Boden, will be 29 years. From that, you must have deducted the number of days you have already spent in custody, which I'm told is 519 days. Please can Stephen Boden be taken down? Weighing up these factors, the minimum term in your case, Shannon Marsden, will be 27 years. From that, you must have deducted the number of days you've already spent in custody, which I'm told is 519 days. Please can Shannon Marsden be taken down?
You are watching the sentencing of Stephen Boden and Shannon Marsden for the murder of their 10-month-old son, Finley Boden, which occurred in 2020, Christmas Day of 2020. As we heard there, the judge sentencing Stephen Boden to 29 years minimum sentence and Shannon Marsden 27 years. Caterina Vitozzi is at Derby Crown Court. Caterina, the reaction?
It has been an extremely difficult sentencing to hear Mrs. Justice Amanda Tipples going in to extreme detail about the injuries sustained by 10-month-old Finley by the hands of the people he should be able to trust most, his mother and father, Shannon Marsden and Stephen Boden. We have heard in court victim impact statements read out on behalf of the families of both Shannon Marsden and Stephen Boden, and these are extremely moving. They paint the picture of families who were continually lied to by Shannon Marsden and Stephen Boden, a couple who told social services they were drug-free, that their home was safe, that they were ready to look after their son after he had been taken into care at birth because of both of their drug use. And in those family victim impact statements, the family of Shannon Marsden described the memories that we have of Finley are of a happy, chuckling baby who had all of his life ahead of him. Finley will always be remembered and always be loved. When Finley died, part of us died as well. And the family of Stephen Boden also having a statement read out on their behalf, saying that the couple could have reached out to us for help, but they chose not to. Neither of you showed any remorse. Comments also repeated by the judge in her sentencing. The couple have shown no remorse. They haven't explained exactly what they did to their child to inflict such horrific injuries, more than 130 in total, including fractures, bruises and burns, and they have crucially never explained why they did it. And the families in their victim impact statement said that that will be something that will always haunt them, saying, "We can only describe you both as monsters for what you've done. We will never forget Finley, but we will forget you both." And the couple, Stephen Boden, now sentenced today to a life imprisonment with a minimum of 29 years in prison. Finley's mother, Shannon Marsden, also sentenced to life in prison with 27 years as the minimum term. The distressing details of this case will be remembered for a very long time, and there will be many questions to answer now by the social services team and the family court, who decided that Shannon Marsden and Stephen Boden were a couple who were ready and capable to provide a safe home for their son. As I said, he was removed from their care at birth because of their drug use. The court heard that the couple repeatedly lied to their families, to social services, saying that they were drug-free, that their home was safe, and he was returned to their care full-time at 8 months. Whether that was the right decision will be addressed in a review into that procedure, but the couple here today sentenced to those life sentences, 29 years minimum term for Stephen Boden, 27 years for Shannon Marsden, Finley's mother.
Katerina, thank you very much. Katerina there in Derby Crown Court for us, and we will later be speaking, in fact very shortly, be speaking to a trustee from the Association of Child Protection Professionals to perhaps pose some of those questions raised by Katerina about whether Finley could have been saved with more intervention. But the news for now from Derby Crown Court, the sentencing of the parents of Finley Boden to 29 years minimum sentence for the father, 27 years minimum sentence for the mother, a life sentence. Do come back to us after the break. Hello, you're watching Sky News. Coming up today, the parents of 10-month-old Finley Boden, who died on Christmas Day during COVID lockdown, have been jailed for life for his murder.
You both knew that Finley was very seriously ill and dying as a result of what you had done to him. Yet you deliberately failed to seek any medical help for him.
Also ahead, the families who believe their babies were harmed by the drug Primados have their legal challenge thrown out. At least 2 people die after a Russian missile struck a hospital in central Ukraine. Transgender women are to be banned from competing in elite women's cycling in Britain. An 11-year-old boy remains in critical condition after being hit by a police vehicle in Lancaster. John Cleese is the latest celebrity to appear at the High Court as the hearing continues over phone hacking allegations. And in-flight chaos. What happened when a passenger opened the emergency exit mid-air? Good afternoon. We start with the breaking news that the parents of baby Finley Boden, who died on Christmas Day during COVID lockdown, have been jailed for life. Shannon, Marsden and Stephen Boden, who were found guilty of murdering their 10-month-old son, have been locked up with minimum terms of 27 and 29 years, respectively. The case has been described as savage and brutal. The infant was subjected to repeated acts of severe violence. Sentencing the pair, the judge said, neither of you have shown any remorse at all for what you've done.
The facts in relation to the last days of Finley's life are terrible to describe and very distressing. Finley died in the very early hours of Christmas Day 2020. He was in his cot in your bedroom at home. He died of septicemia, endocarditis and pneumonia. The infections which killed him had all set in and taken hold because of the extensive fractures to Finley's ribs and other bones, which acting together you inflicted on him, and I'm sure you did so before the 16th of December, which was more than 9 days before he died. You both knew that Finley was very seriously ill and dying as a result of what you had done to him. Yet you deliberately failed to seek any medical help for him, and you deliberately made sure that he was not seen by anyone who could have rescued him and taken him away from your care. Medical intervention would have saved Finley's life, and if Finley had been given antibiotics and the necessary care in the minutes and hours before he died, he would have made a complete recovery. He would have been alive today. I'm sure that you both knew Finley was dead when you dialed 999 at 2:27 a.m. on Christmas Day. Finley had, by that time, been dead for over half an hour.
Well, that was the judge at Derby Crown Court. Sky's Caterina Vitozzi has been following events from Derby Crown Court also. And Caterina, a harrowing account of the final days of a 10-month-old baby. Questions, of course, around whether he ought to have been returned to his parents so soon. But today, any closure for the families?
Well, today the families heard that Shannon Marsden, Finley's mother, and Stephen Boden, Finley's father, both received those life sentences with minimum terms for Finley's father of 29 years and for his mother, Shannon Marsden, of 27 years. But as you said, there are questions now, not only about how this happened and why this happened, things that it was noted by the judge that Shannon Marsden and Stephen Boden have never explained exactly what they did to their son and why they did it, but also questions with regards to the process by which their son was returned to their care. Finley was in care since birth because it was decided that before he was born he would be taken into the care of social services because of his parents' drug addiction. However, The court heard how the pair repeatedly lied to their families, to social services, convincing them that they were drug-free and that their home was safe and it was an environment in which they could properly care for Finley. However, under 2 months after he returned to their care full-time, Finley was dead. And in fact, we have just had a statement from Derbyshire County Council, which I'll read to you, saying the sentencing of Finlay's parents after their conviction for his murder is another stage in the legal process following his tragic death. And our thoughts are with everyone who knew and loved him. We remain fully engaged with the independent local child safeguarding practice review, a statutory legal process commissioned by the Derby and Derbyshire Safeguarding Children Partnership to look in depth at the role of all agencies following Finley's death. When that review is concluded later this year, we will be in a position to communicate more fully about this case. And I think the timeline of what happened to Finley is something that undoubtedly deserves further scrutiny and will raise plenty of questions for his extended family. As I say, Finley in care since before he was born, returning full-time to his parents when he was just 8 months old, and under 2 months later dying, being found dead in his home Christmas Day 2020.
All right, thank you very much. Katerina Vitozzi there at Derby Crown Court. We're going to stay with that story and get some more reaction, this time from Dr Kieran Murphy, who is a trustee of the Association of Child Protection Professionals, which offers support and professional development for government and policymakers working within that space, within the child protection and safeguarding space. Good afternoon to you. Thank you for being with us today. And a horrendous account of what happened to a 10-month-old baby. I think it's really important that we begin by saying, I'm so sorry, we are going to just cut in and take you back to Derby Crown Court. This is a moving story. Do stay with us, Kieran. We're going to go back to Derby Crown Court for a police statement.
Sure, Senior Investigating Officer. Today, we've seen a mother and father jailed for what is quite simply an incomprehensible crime. Over the course of little more than a month, Shannon Marsden and Stephen Boden assaulted their son Finley, leaving him with 57 fractured bones across his tiny body. The heartbreaking reality is that Finley's last days would have been spent in immense pain, a fact that would have been abundantly clear to both parents. They knew that they were responsible for those injuries, and instead of doing the right thing and taking Finley to get urgent medical care, they took him shopping in Chesterfield Town Centre as though nothing were wrong. In actual fact, Finley was dying. Boden and Marsden, from the moment Finley returned to their care, throughout the trial, after conviction, and even at sentence, have never taken responsibility for their actions. They lied and obstructed professionals who were attempting to see Finley to establish that he was being cared for in the correct manner. They refused because they knew that once a professional saw the state of the home and the condition that Finley was in, he would have been taken from their care. They conspired between them to ensure that no professional would see Finley and keep their awful crimes a secret. But we now know the truth, and they have paid the price with their liberty. I hope that for Finley's wider family, today will bring a degree of closure, and they can now focus on the happy memories they had with Finley, who was clearly much loved and a very happy young boy before those fateful days in December 2020. I would like to take the opportunity to thank them for their support and strength during what has been a long and difficult investigation. And I would now ask that their privacy is respected following today's sentence. I want to thank all those that worked on bringing Boden and Marsden to justice, in particular the staff who worked so tirelessly on the investigation, the Crown Prosecution Service team and Prosecution Council, who together built a case that has allowed justice for Finley Boden. Thank you.
How would you describe Stephen Boden covered this case and you've seen the court.
It's absolutely incomprehensible and despicable what they have done. They are truly reprehensible with no consequence for what actions they could have done.
And you've covered lots of cases like this in terms of what you've seen, heard and witnessed.
The injuries are the most horrific that I've seen, and the fact that they had the opportunity to seek medical attention for that child and failed to do so simply for their own means is beyond words. Thank you.
All right, there we heard from the District Crown Prosecutor for the Crown Prosecution Service, East Midlands, summing up what we'd already heard from the judge at Derby Crown Court and talking of the parents of Finley Boden as criminals truly reprehensible. I'd like to come back to our guest, Dr Kieran Murphy, from the trustee of the Association of Child Protection Professionals. As we were saying, and I think there the Crown Prosecution Service really articulating the horror in this case, as we'd heard from the judge. If there is to be a sense to us hearing all the atrocious details of Finley's last few days, it is to try and stop this happening to another child. And I think it's important for us to start by saying that the workers across all the agencies involved do an incredibly difficult job, and across all those agencies, these cases are absolutely horrendous for them. We must remember, of course, that the people responsible for Finley's death at the end of the day were his parents. With that said, in the end, the decision made to return Finley to his parents sooner and faster than had been expected was made by magistrates. With your experience, do you think it's right that magistrates who are volunteers, who are unpaid, ought to be able to make those kind of life-changing decisions?
Belle, first thing I'd like to say is how shocked and appalled I am by the details of the abuse. That listening to the judge's sentencing there has shocked me, and you know it's very, very emotive. So I want to send my sympathy out to Finley's loved ones first and foremost. In response to that question, we live in a less than ideal system, a less than ideal world. My preference is always that cases like this should be before judges, before people with expertise within the room, for reasons only like the one you've just asked me. After the fact, retrospectively, we shouldn't be asking questions about the expertise of the people making these decisions.
Yeah, and in this case, magistrates, perhaps in your opinion, not having enough expertise to be able to make these calls.
I don't know the magistrates in question, but I would say that a family court judge is always best placed to make decisions about permanency and the long-term care of a child.
And of course, there are various agencies involved in this. There's the local social care services, there's the Child Protection Agency, there are the courts as well. The last professional to see Finley alive was a social worker. She peered through a window, she saw him alone, asleep on a sofa. She couldn't get access to the house at that time, as we've heard during the sentencing. Now, that was almost a month before he died. I wonder why you think there were no visits in between that time. Is that a failure of the social services?
I think that there's a huge context that I'm sure your audience would like to know, Belle, and we haven't got enough time. But again, living in a less than ideal system, we have a chronically underfunded children's services system at the moment, like other services we have around the country, that's lost between 50 and 80% of its funding since 2010. So answers to questions like that are always going to be very difficult without knowing the specifics and the context of the case. You know, ideally, we wouldn't be seeing children alone on a couch and then not following up. But I don't know if the social worker did not follow up. What I am very conscientious of is the judge's remarks that these were persuasive and effective liars. And I was grateful for your introduction there about, you know, the diligence and hard work that people working within the child protection system put in, and that the people who are ultimately responsible are the parents. We naturally look for someone to blame. And yes, the only slightly positive thing that could come out of this is that we learn, if any mistakes were made, how we can try and avoid them again in the future. But I regularly come back to this point when I'm asked about this type of absolutely horrendous case, incomprehensible case.
Having said what you said there, that we learn every time, what would you learn from this particular case? What would your learning be from this one?
I think from this case, I mean, I tweeted out when I read about the case the other day, my concern, which I've been talking about for years, that those who are furthest away from the child are making decisions about that child. Those with less expertise about the child are making decisions about the child. I do think it's regrettable that the social worker who had the best relationship, the most knowledge of Finley, their voice was not holding sway within the family court. So whilst the local authority were asking for a 4-month gradual rehabilitation home, which would have been much slower on the basis that there were still concerns about the parents' ability to care for Finley, that wasn't preferred over the guardian's decision in the court. Guardians are fantastic, they're highly overworked like child protection social workers, but that decision was preferred when the guardian had only met Finley once via a WhatsApp call. Surely a social worker who on a statutory basis is visiting him every month to 6 weeks since he's been born, knows him in the case more than somebody who's seen him once via a WhatsApp call.
Yeah, and we ought to explain, just for those people who may not be very familiar with the system, that that guardian that you're talking about is the CAFCAS, the Independent Children and Families Court Advisory Service guardian appointed to represent the child in these cases, and who, as you said, had only met Finley over WhatsApp because, of course, of the pandemic. Just on that, had there not been a pandemic, had there not been COVID restrictions, do you think Finley might have been saved?
I do think that what we know about COVID and the impact of those lockdowns, we talked about it extensively, Arthur Labinjo Hughes last year, very sadly, another very, very regrettable case, is that children became less visible. We have an effective child protection system, but in unusual cases, in unusual times, the proverbial net of protection doesn't accommodate children in unusual situations. The system can't accommodate a worldwide pandemic as effectively as we would want it to. So children who aren't being seen, we need to see children in order to protect them. And I know that social workers were some of the few professionals still going into homes, health visitors as well, but we weren't seeing them as much as we would like. And it was really interesting, the judge's remarks about how the parents used the COVID-19 pandemic to perpetuate their lies. So, for example, saying that Finley had COVID.
What about in cases like this, where the parents are particularly adept, persuasive in the words of the judge, manipulators, and that they're able to cover up their crimes incredibly effectively? Do you have faith that social services, in their current state, are able to see through parents like that or carers like that?
I'm very concerned about the chronic underfunding of the child protection system, Belle, and I think that if we're going to prioritise the children of this country, we need more than less than 8% of what's been recommended by a national review committed by the government to funding the child protection system. We need it. We've lost so much money over the last 12 years. Social workers have massive caseloads. I should say that after the death of Victoria Climbié, Herbert Laming, the Lord Justice at the time, recommended that child protection social workers should have no more than 13 cases. I can tell you my latest piece of research is going on at the moment, which is consistent with findings over several years. I have social workers with over 40 cases. They're spread too thinly. And what those social workers are saying is, if we haven't got time to spend with children, how do we actually know what they really need and want? How can we be effective at protecting them if we can't spend time with them? And we need smaller caseloads, we need more investment. If we really value the children of this country, like I think we do, as a society, we need to invest effectively in the child protection system. Josh McAllister asked for